Hello, I'm here with Vaney Hariri to have a conversation about race and Christianity, and more than anything, for me to learn just as much as anything, kind of to help perspective on things that are not clear to me. So first off, I'm sure many people watching this video know you, but for the very few who don't, who you are.
Yes, Vaney Hariri. I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Think 3D, specialize in leadership development training and organizational culture consulting. Aside for that, I just try to be a participant in the community, both in the terms of advocacy and activism, and then just working in the community, whether it be on boards, commissions, that type of thing.
How many boards are you on?
7. 7. Yes.
I asked the question. He's not bragging. He's very giving of his time. You're a musician too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Musician as well. I'm a habitual board member, so I can't really help that. I'm just a general. I'm a jack of all trades, proudly.
All right. Well, thank you for being for having this conversation with me. What I'm hoping to my goal in this conversation is to kind of help people like me, people who aren't impacted by racism, to hear a little bit of your perspective on how this has affected you and people. One thing that I've noticed is it's easy for people like me who aren't impacted by racism to feel like we live in South Dakota, we live in Sioux Falls, we're above that. We're immune to these issues that are happening elsewhere, that this is a Minneapolis problem, a Georgia problem, a Louisville problem. And every once in a while we get stark reminders, only almost relationally, only because I know you and get to hear your perspective on the way that this impacts you, because I don't experience this. So I wonder if you'd share a little bit of to help kind of for those people who feel like we in South Dakota that maybe it's different here. Would you share a little bit about not that you love your community?
For sure.
You love Sioux Falls, so you're not here to criticize Sioux Falls, but racism is alive and real, and it impacts you and people who look like you.
Yeah, well, it's less about criticism and more about accountability. I think sometimes the confusion that we have is that the things that we love, we don't challenge.
Yeah.
If I love it, then I only can say glowing or good things about it. But it's because I love it that I can see the cracks, that I can see the opportunities for us to be better. And that's really where it starts, it's just the desire to be better. But in terms of the experience, of course those things happen here. Because, people here got the same programming that everybody else got. And when I say programming, I mean both intentional and unintentional. When you go your whole life without seeing a person of color in a position of power, or seeing them in a position of wealth, or seeing them in a position of influence, you start to naturally develop the impression that they're not supposed to be there, because they're not there. And because in the world, we tend to think that things are as they should be, right? And we certainly don't believe that there are any nefarious forces doing those things, because we're all good, we're all Midwest nice.
Yeah.
But it's no different than how the Midwesterners tend to think, right? It's hard sometimes for the average Midwesterner to think big, or think that they're supposed to be on TV, or think that they're supposed to be a superstar, or see themselves as the next big whatever, because we don't see ourselves there. That's not for us, that's for people on the coast. It makes sense for somebody in New York to reach a certain level of success, but Iowa, maybe not so much. Peer, probably not, right? And so those are the things that people can identify with to make the connection between how it might feel. So when people are getting that information in, and they're seeing only visions of people being criminals, only visions of people being subservient, only visions of people being in support positions, and they're not seeing it in terms of leadership positions and wealth and all those things I mentioned before, you start to develop an attitude about what you feel like is appropriate or not appropriate, what is possible or not possible, what is fair or what is not fair. And so to think that we weren't affected by that programming, no different than people in other places were, or the South, is just naive, to be honest with you. And there's also an assumption, just in terms of the northern states in general, that we were somehow above it. But if you really go into the history of it, we were not. It may have taken different forms. And
there's very, very specific. Again, there is, I think, an arrogance in the North of saying, we were not a slave state ever.
Right.
But recently, you uncovered some shocking evidence, maybe shocking to me. Maybe you were aware of this, but here in Sioux Falls, would you share this discovery of the way that the deeds or the titles to property specified that only Caucasians could build on that property here in Sioux Falls?
Yeah. So just a week ago, a friend of mine got word that there was some land available to purchase. So, he didn't know if he was going to buy it, and I was just interested in looking at the plat for that land. And the city to send it over, which they did. They sent over a copy of the plat, and the very first line in the description says this lot is to be sold to the Caucasian race only. And now, this was in 1950. So first of all, not that long ago. Most of us right now, our parents were alive at that time, maybe young, but alive at that time. And so it's still pretty relevant. Now, that legally is not enforceable right now, but what it speaks to is the chain. And so when we talk about systemic racism, that's a great example, right? Because as we were discussing a little bit earlier, the language is very important. Because it doesn't even say, do not sell this lot to a black person, or do not sell this lot to a Hispanic person, or anything like that. It's Asian race only. That speaks to a different level of intention. An intention of making sure that land, which is power, land, which is wealth, okay, land, which is the ability to design what is happening in your community, be passed only to white people. The idea of white supremacy, the idea of white power, that somebody had intention of preserving that white supremacy into the future, this future, our present.
This is explicit. This is not just bias or prejudice. This is
intentional. First
codified, written there.
The first line. It wasn't in the fine print. It was in fact the print, and it was done with an intention again to continue this. When people talk about systemic racism or we talk about white privilege, a lot of times how people just manifest that is someone diminishing their experience, right? My dad wasn't rich, I worked hard, I did whatever, da 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 da. No one's diminishing your experience, and no one's asking you to be guilty about it. We're just asking you to do something about it because there was an intention here. And I was a banker for over a decade, and what I know what people do with their land is they use the equity. They use the equity to start a business. They use the equity to put their kids into college. They use the equity to buy more land. They use the equity to do various things that allow them, or they just use the equity for the wealth, right? To compound that wealth, pass on that home. It develops generational wealth. So when we talk, and everybody does it, everybody understands the concept. That's the reason why you have life insurance. That's the reason why you make trusts. That's the reason why you do all these things.
People use the term legacy, this legacy that you want to pass on. Yeah.
Right. And this person was operating in a way where they specifically wanted to ensure that the legacy only was passed to whites. And that is an example of systemic racism, is that if a black person came money to buy the property, had the same intentions to pass on that wealth, the same intentions to develop wealth, the same intentions to establish a legacy within their bloodline, even if they had the money and the intention to purchase it, even if they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and did everything that was necessary to purchase it, they would not have been able to. That is systemic racism. That is white privilege. Again, what we're dealing with is not did you do it, it is the ripple effects of it, just like anything else, which is why we do these things. Think about this for a second. We have autonomous vehicles, we have space flights, private space flight, we have iPods and iPads and all these other type of things, right? And we still run the largest military in the world, the largest economy in the world, the most powerful country in the world, still runs off of a document that's 250 years old. We run off of, we're about to go into 4th of July, where our forefathers created this country. We still operate off of that framework. How? Why? 250 50 years later with this intention. Somebody laid things in place to make sure that some of these things were still running and operating well into the future. What would make someone think that racism was not one of those things? When that document was created, we were referenced as 3/5 of man. We weren't even identified as a full human. No voting rights. The very things that they promised, all men are created equal, the very things that were promised in there were denied to us, knowingly, willingly, intentionally. And so the idea that somehow everything else carried on into today, except for racism, again, is naive.
Yeah, and so you talk about systemic racism and how that's passed on. I'm just making sure we're still recording. My screen went dark. You talked about, and you didn't specify, but this sense of seeing black people in authority, that's something that not seeing that impacts. You didn't say this, but it does impact both white people and black people.
For sure.
Would you say a little so a white person, that may impact them to where it's jarring and shocking to see someone, a black person or a person of color in authority. But when young black people don't have authority figures who look like them, would you say a little bit about the impact that has?
Well, so I'll ask you a question. So I do JA, junior achievement, every year, and I always tell them that put me where you need me. And so they put me in the majority minority school, because you have young folks there that don't see people that are like them, and so that's why it's a rarity. That's why they choose to put me there. And I ask the young people, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do for a profession? What do you think most of them say?
What age?
8th grade, anywhere from 6th to 8th grade.
Boys or girls? I could share my experience when I worked with inner city youth. Almost all the boys said a basketball player or a rapper.
Right. Why do you think that is?
That's the people of color that they look up to are rappers and basketball players.
Those are the only people that they see that are successful in the way that they might want to be successful.
Yeah.
Right? Because that is all they see. Right? Some people
don't see fake presidents. They don't see lawyers. The
CPA.
So that's something to aspire to.
Right. Yeah. People have to see it to be it. Yeah. They have to see it to be it. And so now again, it's not just what you see, but it's also what is in your proximity. So if your parent was a CPA, you might be a CPA. If your parent was a whatever, Well, when those positions were not available to someone's parents, their kids didn't see it in their home, so they weren't that. And then their kids didn't see it, and they weren't that. And then their kids didn't see it, and they weren't that. And so that's how you get to a place where you don't have that same share of all of those different types of positions that influence the health and wealth of a community. And so, like, it's not hard to track. You know what I mean? Like, it's one of those things where it makes all the logic in the world. And one of the things that I always challenge people is the idea that something's wrong with the system. There's something wrong with a system that operates like this, but there's nothing wrong within the system. It's working exactly the way it was intended to. Right? This is what it was supposed to do. Right? When this thing was created, we weren't in its design. We weren't considered in its design, at least not as people, as property, but not as people. It was illegal for us to educate ourselves for half of the life of this country. Why is that? Knowledge is power. So when you are specifically denying someone the ability to be able to upward mobilize, how dare we, in this age, after the results of that, be frustrated with people's lack of ability to upward mobilize? Like, you would die for it, right? And there's ideas sometimes where these tropes that were developed, these ideas that were developed. Imagine this. Imagine a country that was built on the backs of slaves. There's no question. The way that we went from a country that was just formed to the wealthiest economy in the world in less than 180 years, the way that we did that is through free labor, right? And so when you have a country that was built on the backs of slaves and other indigenous and people of color, isn't it interesting that the trope about black people is that we're lazy? Somebody sat up on a horse or on a porch drinking a mint julep, watching people slave in the sun, literally slave in the sun, and we're thought of as lazy. Imagine having your people raped, murdered, enslaved, beaten, and brutalized, lynched, and you're thought of as dangerous and innately criminal, right? All the things that were done to us were projected onto us. Mm-hmm. So not only did we have to suffer it, but now we have to undo the narrative that we are these things. Mm-hmm. Right? And so these are the things that are happening. So it's more than just somebody physically wanting to do a thing. It's about the psychology of it. Because the biggest misconception about racism is that it requires hate, that you hate another race. That's not the case. It's simply to believe that you are superior or they are inferior because of their race. And so when we think somebody is innately less patriotic than us, we're being racist. When we think that people are just innately more criminal than us, we're being racist because we're saying that we're superior to that or they're inferior to that. There's a lot of people who like me just fine, as long as I have less than they do. As long as they don't have to answer to me. As long as, we're not in any competition. Right? They love me just fine as long as I'm entertaining them. Right? But not in the truest sense of real relationship. And that's racism. You don't have to hate anybody to be racist.
Yeah. Yeah, or be actively persecuting someone.
For sure.
However, there is an impact on people of color today, and it's something that people like me are unaware of, since I've never been looked at with a skeptical eye from police officer or from just homeowners. If I'm walking or jogging in a neighborhood, no one is wondering, do you belong? Do you belong? What do you say to people who might be critics of maybe your point of view, who might say, if you're doing nothing wrong, you don't need to fear the police? What would you say to kind of give them an idea that's not a sensible idea? That in fact blacks do have to fear the police, even if you're doing everything right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can look at the
and again, we don't want to demonize police here.
Right.
We don't. But
for sure. And I'm a community ambassador with the police. Yeah. I work with them more than probably any one citizen, right, to be honest with you, and have deep relationships with them. But again, this is about accountability. I tell people all the time, there's no such thing as a bad cop to me. Mm. And I'll tell you why. There's no such thing as a bad cop, because the uniform doesn't make you a cop. The badge doesn't make you a cop. The gun doesn't make you a cop. The oath makes you a cop. If you honor the oath, you're a good cop. If you don't honor the oath, you are a criminal or you're an accomplice. And so for me, what we challenge police to say is that if you're tired of being confused with bad cops, you have to step away from them. Otherwise, it's confusing. Right? And so we shouldn't have to preference every conversation with most cops are good. Let's just stop it there, off to the side. But if there's one sitting next to one that's not, they're both not. Right? I'll never have the expectation that someone could shoot someone in the street or someone could steal something from a bank and then get into a squad car with a police officer and then they drive around all day.
Or in George Floyd's case, officer standing by while another officer knelt on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Like a lookout.
No. He
literally was like a lookout. Right? We would never be okay with that. So I'm not okay with it just because you wear the same uniform. So that aside. But the idea that, just to draw it all back, especially as a man under God, let's take all the constructs of the United States, all the constructs of modern civilization, let's take all of that out of the picture. When we go back to the Genesis and we dial it back to zero, I am a man created under God. No man has dominion over me. No man should have the expectation that you could come up to me and instruct me to do anything in any manner in which you choose. That I have to justify my existence to anyone. That expectation in and of itself is racist. Mm-hmm. It's racist. Anyone who says you're in my neighborhood and barring actual causation, be suspicious of my presence. You know, you're in my neighborhood. That doesn't seem right. You know, or you're walking into this business. That doesn't seem right. We're not talking about if somebody is using a jimmy or a wire hanger. And yeah, cool. Be suspicious of that. That makes sense. There's criminal behavior potentially taking place. But we're talking about walking, driving, living. If you take a look at all of the people who have been unarmed and killed by the police in the last, say, 20 years, and look at the reasons for the initial interaction, almost all of them are misdemeanors or not crimes at all. And people say, man, just comply. Just comply. A lot of those people's charges, you know how many, there's a significant amount of people who their only charge is resisting arrest. But how? How could your only charge be resisting arrest when you weren't arresting me for anything? We can also look at the hundreds, actually thousands of cases that have been rescinded because of DNA evidence and people coming out saying that they were lying. Or that someone just reviewing the case, the facts as they laid, this person did not commit this crime. It's all there. That data is all there. If anybody wants to go look at it, that data is all there. When we look at mandatory minimums, and that crack was thought of as an inner city drug, a black drug. Cocaine was thought of as a white drug, as a suburban drug, as a business drug. And you needed to have, guess how many more times cocaine you had to have in your possession to get the same sentence as somebody with crack?
10 times.
500 times.
Wow.
500 times more cocaine it took to crack for you to get the same sentence as me. Right now, the U.S. Prison system is filled with a large portion of people of color, majority, around 70%, and a large percent of that 70% is African Americans in particular, who make up 18% of the population, somewhere around there. Okay, the United States has 5% of the world's population, yet 25% of its in prison population. So we put people in jail a lot, like it's a job. And because we have prisons for profit, it is a job. Somebody's making money off of this. But there are 5 times more white people than black people. Now, all the data suggests that white people commit crimes, in particular use drugs, at the same rates as blacks. Violent crime is a little bit different for other factors we could talk about. But they use drugs at the same rates. So just by the numbers, statistically, it should be almost impossible for there to be less white people in prison than any other race. But there's almost twice as many black people as white people for those crimes. It's funny too, because when we have this conversation, people will say, they'll pull up the raw statistics. And not everybody has a firm grip on statistics, but people pull up the raw statistics and they'll say, but there were 200 white people killed by cops, and there was there was 100 black people killed by cops. Not understanding that what that means is
it's still disproportionate.
It is that you're almost 3 times as likely to be killed by a cop as a black person as to a white person. Because there's 5 times more white people than black people.
I'm curious, I want to hear what you have to say about, oftentimes in these circumstances, where there's a killing or violence against young black men that are unarmed and arrested, they dig through their past and victim in order to have the right to life, right? I wonder if you'd say a little bit about that, this need for them to be the perfect victim in order for us to stand up for their right to life.
That is a thing that we say, which is, they'll kill you twice. They'll kill your body, then they'll kill your memory, your spirit, who you are. Right? Because as soon as you die, they'll pull out a thuggy picture. And again, they'll say, why didn't you just do X, Y, or Z? But again.
So let's do a specific. George Floyd was, I guess, paid for something with a counterfeit $20 bill. I don't know if the veracity of that, whether it's true. I don't know whether or not he was aware that this is counterfeit. But he's choked to death over the course of almost 9 minutes while other police stand by. That's not a way that we as a society arrest people. There's no sense of getting them on the ground and choking them. And after this person's killed, George Floyd is killed, people look back and see that he may have had charges or things in his past.
Yeah.
So that as if somehow that means that he deserves what he got.
Well, that's how you dehumanize people, to justify it, so you don't actually have to wrestle with the idea of doing anything. Here's what's interesting. First of all, with that $20 bill, I'm sure anybody in that line would have gave up $20 just to be done with the situation and not even have to deal with it. But where I live was the old address, or has a very similar address to the federal building where people send counterfeit dollars that they've taken in. I get in my mail every couple days somebody who mismailed this counterfeit dollars. That's how many people pass. So people here in South Dakota, innocently, knowingly, whatever, are passing counterfeit bills. Okay, so just nothing about this is nefarious. So if somebody has a counterfeit bill,
well, I could be carrying them and not know.
You're almost guaranteed to be in some way, right? So let's just talk about how that is. But what we do is we dehumanize the person, and so we say this felon, da 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 da. Well, if you were a felon and you were walking around outside, it's because, and if they let you out, presumably you served what you were supposed to do for society. You rectified that issue for society. So you're not a felon anymore. That's a moment in time, and we need to challenge that about our justice system, period. Criminal is not a type of person. Crime is a behavior. It is a moment in time. It is not who you are as an individual. Now, there are habitual criminals that have showed that they don't have any intention of changing their behavior, in which case we may have to deal with that a certain way. But even if you commit a crime, especially one that is so, in that moment, we don't even know if he was actually committing a crime. That's so minuscule. Most using drugs. That right now is legal one state over. So those people right now that are doing that one state over are law-abiding citizens. We have millions of people in our prison systems that are thought of as criminals and will be thought of that way for the rest of their lives for doing the exact same thing. Okay? So let's just talk about our justice system. That doesn't make sense to begin with. But that's how we devalue life. Once we make you a criminal, whatever we do to criminals is okay. But here's the thing. We do two things. We dehumanize people of color, and then we dehumanize police as well. There's two ways that we do that. So we dehumanize people by making them criminals or thugs or whatever. We just assign a word to them. That way we don't have to consider their families or their children or their humanity or their neighborhood or what they have contributed or what they will contribute in the future. We can disregard all that.
Or proper policing.
Proper policing.
That a police officer, there's a certain...
Great point.
Yeah.
Great point. We don't even have to discuss
what
this person may or may not have done wrong. But then we dehumanize the police by making them superhuman. And so now they don't get to raise their hand and say, look, I got PTSD. I got mental issues. I'm in pain. I'm hurting. I'm whatever, because they're infallible. They're these magical, mystical beings that we make into deities that can't make mistakes. And we cheat both of them, right? We do a disservice to both of them. Here's the thing. The other thing about it is that there's a chain to the type of thinking we assign to police, which is once you have done wrong, once you resist, I get to justify anything else that happens to you. Keep in mind, there's a penalty to resisting arrest. So that suggests that you're supposed to arrive at court alive to be charged with resisting arrest, to receive your penalty for resisting arrest, which is not death.
Right.
Okay? So that's number one. The idea that people think that police go out there under the impression that everyone is just going to get in the cuffs and get in the car. Why do they have the guns then? And the tasers, and the baton, and the training, and the radio, and the backup? If you could just walk out there and people just did what you say, I could do that with a polo. right? I don't need anything. I could do that with a standard or regular belt. They understand this. This is baked into the cake that people may in fact resist. That's why they are overly equipped to make sure they can manage those situations. But let's take all that into account. So now you go out and this person resists arrest, and then we say, whatever you do to that person after that is fine. You made me do this. You made me shoot you. You made me do it. Logic is a dangerous logic. It is a logic that we find in domestic abuse oftentimes. Why'd you make me hit you? I didn't want to hit you, but you made me hit you. Now, if I asked you, what profession has the highest rate of domestic violence, what would be your guess?
I don't know, but I feel like you're leading me to police officer.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Law enforcement.
Oh.
That is the highest rate. Now, I'm not even saying that to cast aspersions. I'm saying that to say we need to help them too.
Yeah.
Because they're humans. I deal with police. I have ones that are my friends, and they're humans, and they need to be thought of like humans. Which means they need to be able to make mistakes, and we need to help them and move them along. We need to be able to properly train them. We need to be able to support them and love them and all those other type of things. And we need to be able to hold them accountable. Mm-hmm. Part of the reason why some of this is so challenging is because we as citizens are cowards. Mm-hmm. We won't go talk to our neighbors. So guess what we do when their grass is too long and their music is too loud?
Call the cops.
What do we do when our kids don't want to do their homework and are being too disruptive in our homes and are punching holes in the wall?
Call the cops.
Right. What do we do when there's a mental health person that's in the middle of the street yelling and whatever, and we know that there's something wrong with this person? Who do we call?
Call the cops.
We call them for everything. And because we call them for everything, there has to be way more of them, which makes it harder to be diverse. It makes it harder to give them the long-term training that they need. It makes it harder for them and increases the touch points where something could go wrong. Mm-hmm. We play a huge part in that. We could be better neighbors to each other. We could be better for them. There's people who love cops right now, and they say, Blue Lives Matter, those type of things, and they want to confront people about it. But if they really cared about police officers' safety, they would take a different approach. They would want healing. They would want accountability. They would want these things, because when have police officers been less safe?
Probably never. Yeah. I can't imagine the job of a police officer. It's a hard job. You see, you and I, we drive down the street and we see homes that seem happy, and all they see is the worst, because they're only called to deal with bad things.
For sure.
And it just changes your perspective on the world. But yeah, if we don't hold them accountable, if they're not called to a higher standard, then that's a great disservice that we're doing them.
Yes, and it's our job.
Yeah,
it's our job to hold them accountable. You can't have a community in and of themselves, developing the rules by themselves, enacting those rules on people by themselves, and then reviewing those decisions by themselves. That doesn't even make sense. Like, that is the exact opposite of liberty. That is the exact opposite of a working democracy. That is contrary to everything that this country was built on. So when people are like libertarians or believe in liberty or anything like that, or any type of, and don't want to actually participate in helping guide our police and being leaders for them as well, is absurd. It just does not make sense. It is directly contrary to what we believe as a country. We're supposed to participate.
So you said you were an ambassador?
Yeah. So
tell us a little bit about that. What does that mean?
So
what does you do?
Yeah. So the community ambassador program was developed because there's a lot of people who just, because of their past trauma or perceptions or whatever it is, do not have great relationships with police. In particular, folks that are coming from outside of the country, our immigrant refugee population, where they can just do, like they're doing, atrocious things. And so,
very corrupt, and cops are
very.
Yeah.
And how do you reach into these communities that become insulated because they don't necessarily feel welcomed all the time everywhere else? And so they developed the community ambassador program to be able to take those leaders or people who are more prominent in various communities, so that way we can have discussions when things are being challenging, or they can inform us about certain activities or initiatives or things that they're looking to do, and then we can help share that. For sure. Then we can help share that with our community. So I'm one of the first class of community ambassadors, and we got a chance to go through some different scenarios And it's helpful sometimes because people say, well, they did this because it is. And I can say, no, actually, this is why they do it like that. And that helps me be able to, tamp things down. And then the other piece, it allows me to be able to have a direct line to say, hey, what's going on, guys? There's something not right about this. This happened to this person. We got to talk about it. And they know that I'm coming with the right intentions.
Yeah.
Right? And so I'm excited to be about that, a part of that program. Again, we have people that I care deeply about that are police. And I want the best for them, absolutely. But there has to be accountability, and there has to be challenge. And I want that to be as comfortable as it can be, but sometimes it's not.
So do you know, do you feel like you have a relationship with the chief of police? I don't even know his name.
Absolutely.
What's your sense of, my understanding, there's a lot of talk about how, to cut hair, you have to have more hours of training than to become a police officer. And even in the training to become a police officer, there's not a lot of training in de-escalation, which is a huge part of what their job is the cops are called because there's sometimes a chance of violence. And the best thing that a police officer can do is not to meet violence with violence. There's time for that. But the best thing for everybody is to de-escalate. What's your sense of that strategy and the way and the culture of our police department in training in de-escalating rather than escalating a situation into violence?
And this goes back to what I was saying. We can't let an officer incubate when we're doing a gazillion calls that they're always behind on. You know how many officers want to get out their car and just go talk to somebody? They just want to get out and play basketball with the kids. There's some that are not. There's some that are not. But we got a lot of great officers that want to do that community work, and they can't, right? Because they always have another call.
Yeah.
We're effectively 30, so we're technically 18-ish officers short, really effectively 30, because we have some that are already in training. Now, this is a community that has very low violent crime, and we're still short like that. So you can extrapolate that to a Detroit, a Baltimore, a St. Louis, or whatever, right? That is dealing with real rashes of violent crime. And so when we talk about deploying people, number one, we need to shrink that down so they have more time to incubate these people, so they have more time for them to develop their skills. The other piece of it is this. You train for the scenario in conjunction with how much you plan to see that scenario, right? People do often what they do well. People do often what they do well. Whatever you feel like you do best, that's what you're going to do the most. And so
if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Everything looks like a nail. So if you train 70% of the time for violence and 30% of the time for diplomacy, which one are you more likely to engage with? If the majority of it is authority, if that's what you're basing your job off of, is authority versus communication versus de-escalation, which one are you going to lead with? Which is why somebody can have a broken tail light and within 5 seconds you get out the car, right? Authority is the tool. And it's one of the first ones that people use on their tool belt. And so what we want to think about is how do we move to that de-escalation? How do we have these conversations and make these investments? Because, so for instance, I do organizational culture. So I speak to all of these different organizations, and we go into them all the time. And in all these organizations, when we ask them, hey, why don't you make these investments that you know you need to make in building these relationships? And they said, man, we just don't have the time. All of them. And then we say, how much time do you spend putting out fires? And they go, oh, all my time. Saving you time is not saving you time.
Yeah.
If you spent the time developing a relationship, you wouldn't have to put out the fires, which is going to give you more time.
We need to be more proactive and less reactive.
For sure. And if we're doing that now, what happens is guess what? The profession becomes more viable for young people because they actually see them in a positive light, and they don't just see them as people who are hated or being chastised or scrutinized, but they actually see them as the humans that they are. That happens. That one thing that happens. You develop inroads so that when there is a crime, you don't necessarily have to thwart it in that moment. You get to solve crime. right? Because witnesses will actually participate with you. They'll say, no, I saw him right over there. He lived right around the corner. He stole the thing. I saw him. Because I have a relationship with those police. The other thing that it does is by developing those relationships, you have what is called a pleasant presence. So you have police around, police presence, where you want them to be around.
Right.
And you have people who are policing their neighborhood, where they live, where people know them. And so now, when you see police on a regular basis, guess what that does to crime? It diminishes it. You know what stops crime more than almost anything? Lights. Lights. Those are the type of things that we're talking about in terms of being able to thwart some of the crime. And then the other piece of it is lowering our thirst, our lust for crime and punishment versus crime and consequence.
Right.
Stop trying to put everybody in jail. Again, look at all of those deaths. They're all from broken tail light.
Yeah.
Right? Selling loose cigarettes. Selling CDs without a permit. Sleeping in your home. Oops, sorry, I was in the wrong house and you're dead. My bad. Right? Those things are insane. The one where the guy was killed in Atlanta. Now, keep in mind, you look at the whole video, they talked to the guy for a long time. No doubt about it. Right? But then he ends up dying for a potential DUI. You have his vehicle. First of all, how far did he get? Secondly, you have his vehicle. You know where he lives, you know where he works. How does that end up being a death? I'm not saying just let everybody do whatever, but are we ever comfortable with a broken tail light leading into loss of life?
Yeah, well, what we find out, and this may be the case in Sioux Falls as well, but in large cities certainly, minority neighborhoods are both over-policed and under-policed.
For sure.
That minor infractions, tremendously, like broken taillights and selling loose cigarettes, but when there is violent crime, to follow up on that and go to these calls. And if they had a better presence, if they weren't if they had a better relationship with the community, if they were proactive in building, in being a presence that everyone wanted,
it would change the game. Because you'll hear officers that are in that space, less the street officer or more the detective, who are trying to solve these problems. They're like, we can't solve them. Yeah. There are no witnesses. No one saw anything. No one to give us any information. So it's just a cycle.
Yeah.
Well, this person is going to get out. And that's a closed loop of a small group of people who are doing most of the violent crime that keep getting out. And that's why you need relationship, to be able to get witnesses, to be able to get whatever. Because that person is coming back next door to right there. This person that just shot at 5 people, they live right there, 3 houses down. Why in the world would I tell this person that I'm equally as afraid of about that person when that person is probably going to be back on my block in a couple days? Why would I do that? Why would I put my trust in that? You have people if you're in the inner city and you have somebody in your home with mental health and you need to call somebody, there's a good chance you're not calling the police, because you're putting that person in more danger, because they may act erratic, they may wave their hands around, they may not follow orders the way they're supposed to because they have a mental illness.
Yeah, and you know that they may be at risk. Yeah. So let me ask you this. A big issue nationwide has been the militarization of police. And when we see in a lot of these protests, it's hard to tell a police officer from a National Guard. I mean, they look similar and they've got almost tanks. And what has happened when a police officer kind of dresses and feels like a soldier is there is a tangible difference in how they feel. Where police are one of us, kind of representing us in the community. But when you're a soldier patrolling, it's us and them. It's soldiers or them, rather than a group of people that in the community, rather than someone among us. And that's become an issue in many cities where you have a police force that feels like it's us versus them. They feel like we're cops versus the city rather than representing the city. What do you see as far as the police culture in Sioux Falls? As far as, is it an us versus them as far as cops? Do they feel like that, or do most cops kind of feel like they are citizens who are?
There's always been a line right, that we talk about, which is that thin blue line, and which is a brand now, right? You can go in a merchandise store and get it, right? It's like, it's been co-opted, and so there is a line. There's a lot of officers that are going to go to the FOP to drink, have a beer, then go to the bar to have a beer. Now, there's some good reasons for that, right? Because when people find out that you're a cop, sometimes they don't treat you well, right? And then you feel the necessity to maybe do something off duty that you don't want to do, whatever. So there's reasons why people have that anxiety around that are legitimate. There's a reason why you might be insulated in your group, and that naturally creates some level of otherness. But when we talk about the militarization of it, most of it was predicated by 9/11 and us equipping for certain things and internal terrorism. And don't get me wrong, there is a slice where that does make sense. I mean, because if a group out here, a militia out here in the woods, can get whatever they can on the internet and stockpile it, and they're training, people don't really realize the reality of those type of things. Let's say a group of 20 well-trained people who are running drills every day for the last couple of years decided to come into the town. What they would be able to do, especially with some of the protective equipment that you can have right now, would blow anyone's brain if they really thought about it. So there's a slice of law enforcement that has to be prepared for heavy artillery, right? That has to be prepared for whatever. We saw that in certain riots and various things where people were coming out with artillery that the average police couldn't match. Some of that makes sense. I think the Sioux Falls were far more thoughtful about how we deploy those type of things, and you generally won't see officers like that unless it's specifically SWAT, and SWAT is deployed in a very specific way. They kind of have a matrix on how they deploy those type of things. So I think we're far more responsible with that than most people. In fact, one of my good friends is one of the SWAT commanders and was a SWAT sergeant, and I know the type of thought that he puts into deploying those particular tools, right? And actually, if you wanted to ask me, I would tell you that some of the officers that I think are best, and actually usually our resource officers are the one that actually engage in the committee the most, are the ones that are on SWAT. So I think our situation is a little bit different that way. But in terms of that, because there was a large period on a run of hiring people that were paramilitary. And for a couple of reasons. Number one, they already had tactical training that you can lean on. There are certain skills that you didn't have to train into them that they already knew. They're already command structure based. All of those other type of things. It makes it plug and play. The problem is that, again, a lot of those people in those positions have been trained to be an occupying force. Now, there's some different situations where people in recent years, our military over there is doing more civilian engagement, that type of thing. But that attitude is a specific attitude that's trained into you.
Get out of the car,
right.
Yeah.
And you have
us versus them.
And you have to be ready because listen, somebody that might be a child might have an IED. Okay? There's a thought process that has to go into that. And so now when you're here, there might be somebody that's just living their life or playing with a BB gun in the park, a la Tamir Rice. And if you watch that video, the police officer pulled up, and before the car came to a full stop, was door open and started shooting. Okay? It's those type of things. That's really what the issue is. And so the biggest thing for us here in our community is understanding that our police, you mentioned the chief, I have a lot of faith in our police chief. I really do think he's a quality individual. I do think he's a good man. I do think we have a lot of great officers, men and women that are doing amazing things. But we got to do more. We got to do better. Complacency is what we have to challenge ourselves against in this community.
Yeah, and I know that you're one of the organizers of the rally, the Sunday night rally here in town at downtown. And I know one thing that warmed my heart about our community that we love is that this isn't a rally, an us versus them rally, that you've got a chance that the city, the mayor, and also the police chief, they wanted to sit down with the organizers to be able to have a conversation just about. Would you say a little bit about that and just the work in general that you're doing here in Sioux Falls and for justice?
Yeah, we talk with the chief, we talk with the mayor, we talk with the sheriff. Keep in mind, I have a atypical amount of access in terms of how the chief will take my call, the mayor will take my call, all those type of things. That's special. Many communities don't have that. Like I said, what we have to face is complacency. Both of them can say, listen, we have X amount of murders a year. Nothing's burning. Da, 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 da. We can do that kind of dance for forever, and they would be right. But that's not what we're playing for. We're not playing for right now. When you look at Minneapolis and we look at what's happening there, it's not happening here because we're special. It's not happening here because we're early. You put 200,000 more people here. You increase the diversity by 40%, like our elementary schools and high schools suggest is going to happen in the next 5 years. It's going to get real different real quick because we're not doing that level of work. We're not taking peacetime to dig our roots in, to really do the challenging things, the things while we have the relationship to do it. Because I promise you, once a George Floyd happens, once 2 George Floyd happens, once 3 George Floyd happens, once a Breonna Taylor happens, once a Ahmaud Arbery happens, once some of those things happen, you will not have the relationship. You will not have the appetite to work together. You're going to see these choruses that are happening about not just defund the police, which we get caught up in the syntax, but it is actually dismantle the police, which is the thing that people are saying. That they don't want them there, period.
Right.
And they understand the prospects of what the world would look like without police. But what you have to ask yourself is, how must somebody feel about police to not want police?
Right.
They got to feel like you're a worse option. That should alarm everyone. Loss of life should alarm everyone. Tension like this should alarm everyone. And we should be working to fix it. And so for me, that means that we have to do things that are uncomfortable. We have to do things that are challenging. That means that I have to look at my friend in the face and say, I need you to do more. This is not right. You can do better. I can be friends with you, but I have to be able to tell you the truth. What happens when you have a friend that is addicted to drugs? What happens when you have a friend that is abusing their wife? What happens if you can love the person, but does that mean you have to accept their behavior? Does that mean that you can't ask more of them? Does that mean that you can't challenge them? That's not a real relationship then. That's not real. If the moment that I step outside of praising you, I'm thought of as attacking you, that's not a real relationship.
So I feel like you've said a lot right there, as far as the path forward. That we need to have real relationships,
right?
Authentic relationships where there's accountability and mutual love and support. Right. And this needs to be multiracial. We need Caucasians to befriend people of color and vice versa, and support people outside of our community. Because I think if you have relationships with people who look different than you, it's a lot harder to demonize them, to think. So you may say, well, these other people are like that, but this person that I know is different, which is a step in the right direction at least.
Right, it's something.
So a big question, because I know that we're running out of time.
Yeah.
A couple questions I want to ask is like, as you're working for this, what can you share for those watching this video, people at Church of the Resurrection, anybody watching this video, black, white, whatever race?
Hi, thanks for watching my conversation with my friend Vaney Hariri. The last few minutes of this conversation were cut off due to a technology glitch. But in these few minutes we discussed positive things that we can do to help. What can we do to pursue racial reconciliation? And there are some very obvious things as far as just building relationships with people across ethnic lines. Praying for reconciliation and things like that. We talked about mentoring relationships, and I will include a link below in the comments here to LSS, Lutheran Social Services, and their mentoring program, which is very good, where you can build relationships and support youth in our city. But Vaney also has a website that I would direct you to, and that website is howicanhelpsf.com. So go to howicanhelpsf.com. I've got that down in the comments here. And thanks again for watching, and God bless you.